Laodicea. I know all the things you do, that you're neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were one or the other, but since you're like lukewarm water, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. You say, I'm rich. I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. And you don't realize that you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So I advise you to buy gold from me, gold that has been purified by fire. Then you will be rich. Also buy white garments from me so that you will not be shamed by your nakedness, and ointment for your eyes so that you will be able to see. I correct and discipline everyone I love. So be diligent and turn from your indifference. Look, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in, and we will share a meal together as friends. Those who are victorious will sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat with my Father on his throne. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he's saying to the churches.
We're so glad that you're with us today as we wrap up this series that we're calling Dear Church, What We're Getting Right and What We're Getting Wrong. We've been looking at the 7 letters that Jesus sends to 7 different churches in Asia Minor. Now, when we think about letters going to churches, we typically think about Peter writing a letter or Paul writing a letter. We don't think about Jesus. And in fact, when we think about Jesus writing a letter, some of the tone and some of the things that Jesus says in this letter are a bit shocking. So I've heard from many of you how you've grown through this series and how this series has helped you understand a lot more about the New Testament world and, of course, what Jesus is doing in your life. And so we rejoice with you in that. Well, so as we get started today, how many of you have ever been locked out of your house before or your apartment? Okay, that's such a fun experience, isn't it, to be locked out? So maybe for you, you're bringing in the groceries, you bring them in, you lay them on the counter, put your keys on the counter, you go back for another load, and then you come back and you're like, oh man, the door is locked, right? And so what do? You bang on the door, and of course, all your family, they have AirPods in, don't they? They got their earbuds in, they're not listening, you can't get anyone to pay attention to you, and your dog that normally goes berserk when anyone else is at the door is just sitting there, all calm and collected, well-trained, and you're thinking, what is going on? And you're thinking, I own this house, right? I lease this apartment, and I was like, I paid for it with my blood, sweat, and tears, and now here I am, I'm locked out. That's frustrating and can even be embarrassing. And this is what we see happening to Jesus in Revelation 3, being locked out. We're talking about the city that Jesus writes this letter to, the church actually, not the city. Jesus writes to the church in that city, Laodicea. And this is a city that of these 7 churches, you've probably heard some messages about. Now, the first one would be Ephesus, the church that lost its first love. You've probably heard a few messages about that. But this church, this last one, is more famous because people have done quite a few messages on this church and what was happening. This was a city that was wealthy. This was a city, in fact, not only was it wealthy, it had a textile industry, wool that was famous for, and then it had this special salve, this ointment that you could apply to your eyes that helped heal some of the common illnesses of that time. And so here is this city full of wealth. In fact, Tacitus, one of the Roman historians, records for us that an earthquake hits Laodicea in AD 60, and they refuse any help from the Roman Empire. They said, we don't need help. We've got enough resources. We can rebuild it on our own. Can you imagine a major earthquake hitting LA? Totally levels it, destroys it. And then LA says, we don't need FEMA. We don't need the federal government. We got so many wealthy citizens. We'll just rebuild it on our own. We'd be like, wow, that is impressive. This is what Tacitus says about Laodicea. He says, one of the famous cities of Asia, Laodicea, was that same year overthrown by an earthquake, and without any relief from us, recovered itself by its own resources. I mean, here was a city that prided itself on wealth, pulling itself up from its bootstrap. We don't need anyone else. We are self-sufficient. So I want to point out something to you, that even though they were self-sufficient, they had this embarrassing problem. What would be an embarrassing problem for a wealthy city? But Jesus addresses it here in verses 15 and 16. He says this, I know all the things you do, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were one or the other, but since you are like lukewarm water, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. That seems pretty intense, you know? Why is Jesus talking about water here? Well, Laodicea had an embarrassing problem with their water. Laodicea was part of a tri-city area, kind of like we live in here with Albany, Schenectady, and Troy. They had a tri-city area as well with Laodicea, Colossae. You may have heard of Colossae before because Paul wrote a letter to that city, to that church. And what was it called? It's called Colossians. And then the other city that was a part of that tri-city area was Hierapolis. Hierapolis had warm water. In fact, they had warm springs that you could go in and take baths, and the medicinal value for those hot springs. Colossae had cold water that was coming down from the mountain. Laodicea, it didn't have water. Laodicea had to pipe its water in 5 to 6 miles away. And so as it was traveling on the aquifers, it would pick up minerals. And then by the time it got to the city, it was pretty disgusting. Most people didn't like it. They couldn't drink it. It made many people bitter and they wanted to just spit it out. You know, it was this embarrassing problem for such a wealthy city that no one liked the water. Like, have you ever taken an out-of-town family member or guest when they come to visit the area? You ever taken them to Congress Park before? Here's some evil people. There's some very evil people, you know? And you take them to the fountain, you know, and you're like, listen, people come from all over the world to drink from these springs for their healing minerals and the health that it brings to you, you know? And here's a cup, try it out. You pull your phone out and you're like, this is gonna be good, you know? And you film it. And then of course, what do they do as soon as they drink the water? They spit it out. Why? Because that's disgusting. All those minerals that are in there, you have a good laugh, and then you say, I know, I shouldn't have done that. That's mean. Let's go to Ben & Jerry's. I'll make it up to you, you know? And so but this is what was happening in Laodicea. But despite all of their wealth and industry, that they couldn't fix this problem with their water, and it was embarrassing them. It's kind of like New York City, right? I mean, it's a great city, but it has an embarrassing problem. It stinks. It smells bad. It smells like pot, doesn't it? You go down there and you're like, oh man, it's a great city, but it smells terrible. Here's Laodicea, their water, no one wanted to drink it. And Jesus was saying, listen, when he was talking about them being hot or cold, he wasn't talking about the spiritual temperature of their soul. He wasn't saying, hey, I wish that you were cold like an atheist or hot like a Jesus freak. That's not what he was talking about. Jesus was talking about usefulness. For example, how many of you like coffee? Like almost everybody in here likes coffee. And we like it one of two ways, don't we? We like our coffee iced or we like it hot, right? Who says, I would love to have the stale coffee that's been on the counter all day long, right? Like no one wants that, right? When the waiter or waitress comes up, what does she say? I got a fresh pot right here. Would you like some? Hey, can I warm up your coffee for you, right? No one likes warm, stale coffee that's been there. We either like it iced coffee or we like it hot. And this is what Jesus is saying. There's no use. No one sells warm, stale coffee. And Jesus was saying the same thing about their spiritual life. He was saying, listen, there's no benefit on the cold side, like the water that's coming in to Colossae, or the hot side, like Hierapolis. Jesus is talking not about the spiritual temperature of their soul. Jesus is talking about their usefulness. And Jesus is saying, I want you to be useful for my kingdom. You're not cold, you're not hot, you're just something that in fact makes me want to spit you out, that makes me want to vomit you out of my mouth. That's some pretty strong language, right? When you think about Jesus saying, you're not useful to my kingdom. Now, of course, now remember, who's Jesus writing this to? Jesus is writing this to a church in the city. He's not saying that about one specific Christian, but what have we been saying this whole series? We've been saying if it's true of you, then it's true of what? Us. Because who's the church? We're all part of the church. And so if enough of us, this is true of us, then it gets out of balance and then it becomes true of us. So notice what Jesus says here in verse 17. Jesus says, you say I am rich and I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. Well, that's true of that city, right? They didn't need Roman help. Tacitus records that they're going to build on their own. They're self-sufficient. They prided themselves in that. And then Jesus says, but you don't realize that you are wretched and miserable. And then he just strikes right at the core of their identity. They're poor, you're blind, and you're naked. What did they pride themselves in? Being wealthy. What did they pride themselves in when he says they're blind? The eye salve that they sold and exported around the Roman Empire. And then he says that they were naked. They prided themselves in the textile. He's saying, you think just because all this stuff on the outside looks great, that you are also great on the inside. Jesus was saying, you confused physical comfort with spiritual health. You think because everything is okay on the outside, then it must mean everything is okay on the inside. We do that today, don't we? We think, well, if everything's okay on the outside, then that must mean that everything's good with me and God. And then if things are not good on the outside, then that must mean things with God and me aren't going so well. Jesus is saying there's not a correlation here between your outside and your inside. Things were going great for the church in Laodicea on the outside, but Jesus said, that's not telling the whole picture. It's not true of what's going on inside of you. You think you're rich, but you're not. You think that you're strong, but you're blind, you're poor, and you're naked. So remember, as we've been saying in this series, that this isn't just a letter to a city. We've been saying that Jesus is writing this to Christians everywhere, right? Because at the end of each letter, Jesus says, for those who have ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches, let them pay attention, let them hear it. So that creates a question for us. What might Jesus be saying to us as we consider this letter to the church at Laodicea? Could it be that as Jesus thinks about the American church, as Jesus looks at Christian churches all throughout our country, I wonder if Jesus would say, you think that you're rich, but you're really poor. You think just because your retirement account looks great, because the value of your home keeps increasing, because you're doing well financially, that means that your soul is well. I wonder if Jesus would say, listen, American church, you think that you are rich. I mean, you have so many different versions of the English Bible, so many different translations. In fact, so many that you argue about which one is the best. And you have all of this worship music. You have all of these podcasts. You have all of these books. But what you don't realize is you're cold, you're naked, you're blind. You don't realize how far away you are from me. You think because you have all of these things and you have access to all of these things that you're okay with me inside. I wonder if Jesus would say, but let's really be honest for a second. All of this access of this stuff, but has it produced any fruit in your life? Has it produced any fruit in Jesus's church? Can you point to people to say that because of my life, this person is now a follower of Jesus? Jesus is saying, you would think that with all of this wealth of spiritual access that you have, that you would be different. But at the end of the day, you're still consumed with yourself. All you pray about is you. All of your money is spent on you. All of your time goes to you. The things that you're angry about how people have treated you. You think that the church is supposed to be about you. Despite all of the access, despite everything that you know, it's not producing any fruit. And Jesus is saying to the church at Laodicea, and I think he would be saying it to American churches as well, that makes me sick. You're not useful. You're not useful to my kingdom. Listen, you know what Jesus said? Jesus isn't merely disappointed with him. Jesus is saying it makes him sick to his stomach. And do you know what that should cause every single one of us to do? It should cause us to get down on our knees, even just right now, and just say, Jesus, forgive us as we forgive those who have sinned against us. Say, how can we wander so far away from the gospel? How can we wander so far away from the message of Jesus, and now all of a sudden, the only thing that we care about is me, 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 instead of, I wonder how Jesus could use me to be useful for his kingdom. This was a church that knew better. In Laodicea, they had lots of a deep spiritual heritage. Do you know that the Apostle Paul wrote them a letter 30 years earlier? Jesus is writing them a letter, but this church has a rich spiritual heritage. Colossians, Paul says this. Remember, that's the Tri-City area we were talking about with Laodicea, Colossians, and Hierapolis. Notice what Paul writes here. He says, please give my greetings to our brothers and sisters where? In Laodicea, the next town over. He says, and to Nympha and the church that meets in her house. So this was a female lady, a wealthy businesswoman, and the church was meeting in her house. And by that, and because of that, I mean, she's a natural leader in her church as well. So if you think that women don't have a place in spiritual leadership, that's not true of the early church. Women were very important. He goes on and he says, and after you've read this letter, what letter is that? Colossians. He says, pass it on to the church where? In Laodicea, so that they can read it too. And this is very interesting. And you should read the letter that I wrote to them. Isn't that interesting? If Paul had email, it would have made his life so much easier, right? I mean, he just CC all the churches in on it. It took a lot of effort to write a letter. He has to write a letter, then he's got to give it to someone. They have to physically carry the letter to who it was written to. It was a lot of effort. I mean, even a photocopier machine would have saved him a ton of time. And you're just like, all right, we're gonna make 12, and then you go out. So Paul was like, all right, we wrote this one letter. I wrote it to you in Colossians. I want you to take Colossians, and I want you to take it to the church at Laodicea. Laodicea, the letter that I sent to you, I want you to send it to the church in Colossae for them to read it. You say, well, what is that letter? The letter of Laodicea. We don't know. Some scholars think that could be Ephesians, that was meant as more of a general letter instead of one just for Ephesus. And then other scholars believe it could just be a lost letter. We don't have access to it. But what I don't want you to miss is that this town, this city, Laodicea, knew better. They had a great, deep spiritual heritage. In fact, Paul says this also in Colossians 2. He says, I want you to know how much I've agonized for you, those of you who live in Colossae, and also for the church at Laodicea, and for many other believers who have never met me personally. Paul's saying, I've prayed for them, I cared for them, and then here Jesus is saying to this church, he was like, you have this rich spiritual heritage. You know better. And it's making me sick about how useless you are for God's kingdom. That all you want is more for you. Jesus is saying, I don't want to be a consultant. I want to be your king. And what was happening in Laodicea is that Jesus was just a consultant. He wasn't their king. We do it all the time. We do it all the time when we say, I know what the Bible says about this, but I'm not sure I really agree with it. I'll pray about that. You know what? Let me think about it a little bit more. I'm gonna do a little bit more research and I'll get back to you. That's a consultant. Jesus is saying, no, I'm not interested in being a consultant. I'm interested in being your king. And the moment when we say, yeah, I know what the scriptures say, but I don't care. I'm gonna do this anyway. You know what we're saying? We're not following Jesus anymore, we're following ourselves. When we put our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions, what we think is truth over with the truth of scripture, we're not following Christ, we're following ourselves. To be a follower of Jesus, where Jesus is king, we take our thoughts, our opinions, our belief, what culture says, and we submit that to King Jesus. To say, that's what's true. That's what's right. I gave up my ability to say what I think is true or what I think is right or wrong when I decided to make Jesus the king of my life. And here's this church, and they're saying, you know what? We'll take it into advisement. So here's the bottom line today. If you don't remember anything else, this is what I want you to remember. This is what I want you to take a picture of, okay? Here it is. Familiarity with Jesus does not mean fellowship with Jesus. Let me say that again. Familiarity with Jesus doesn't mean fellowship with Jesus. What do I mean by familiarity? Just because you know all the stories in the New Testament and the Old Testament doesn't mean that you're walking with Jesus. It doesn't mean that you have fellowship with Jesus. Just because you've read through all the Gospels doesn't mean that your life, your heart is close and useful for God's kingdom. Just because you know all the words to the songs doesn't mean that you are walking in fellowship with Christ. Just because you gave to paving the way doesn't mean that you are in fellowship with Jesus. Jesus wants you to be in fellowship with him. It's not about familiarity, it's about fellowship. Now, here's the interesting thing to me. This is such grace on Jesus' part. Imagine, so Jesus has some pretty strong language. And for some of you, you might be thinking, that I don't really picture Jesus saying, this church makes me sick. I want to vomit. So imagine Jesus saying this. He's saying, you're not being useful to my kingdom. And then Jesus does something so striking and so shocking. Notice what he says here in verse 20. Look, I stand at the door and if you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and we'll share a meal together as what? Friends. Friends. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Jesus is saying, what you're doing is making me sick, but Jesus is still pursuing them. Jesus is saying, I still want to have a relationship with you. You're still important. Jesus is not showing up to the door with a clipboard. All right, let's just see how you're doing here. Okay, get a check for that, check for that. Ooh, definitely not good there. Yeah, Jesus is not showing up with a clipboard. You know what he's showing up with? Takeout. That's pretty amazing, right? Jesus is saying, hey, I'm here. I'm saying, I want to have fellowship with you. Jesus said, let me in. We'll have a meal together as friends. As friends. Do you have any friends that you can just walk right into their house without knocking? That's special, right? That's kind of different. You got maybe you can count on one hand how many friends you have like that. And when you walk in their house, what do? He's like, anybody home? You're just trying to make sure they got their clothes on, right? Hey, I don't want to get them in an awkward place. Hey, anybody home? You just walk in. Now, how many of you, when you walk into your home, before you walk into your home, you knock on the door? No one does that, right? You're like, why would I do that? I own the house. How many of you in your apartment, how many of you knock before you enter? You don't do that. Why? You're like, I signed a lease. I pay my rent every month and I don't need to knock. It's mine. Now, here's something I don't want you to miss. Jesus is outside of his church that he paid for with his own blood, sweat, and tears. And what is he doing? Why? The church had kicked him out. The church had pushed him out of his own church. It's his church. He paid a high price for it, and they had just pushed him out as a consultant. We'll think about it. We'll pray about it. We'll see. And here's Jesus knocking. Do you know what I would do if I was Jesus? I'd go in and just kick the door down. I'm like, this is my place. What are you doing? Such grace, isn't it? Such grace. That here's Jesus. You've kicked me out of my own house, but I still want to be friends with you. I want you to come back to me. I want you to come back to me. And let's share a meal together. Jesus just knocking on the door. My grandmother's church, behind the pastor, stood a painting of this passage. I remember staring at it sometimes when the pastor got boring. Maybe that's you today, staring at some stuff. And that hurts my feelings that you laugh. But anyway, look at, one of the things I noticed, there's no handle on the outside. It's only on the inside. That you have to invite Jesus into your life. And of course, Jesus, is talking about his church and not just individual lives. But if enough of us kick Jesus out of our life, what does that mean that we've gathered here together today to worship? Not King Jesus, Maybe it's just ourselves. What makes me feel better? Not how do I give to Jesus the glory and honor that he deserves, regardless of how I feel, regardless of what's going on in my life. So I think we have to ask ourselves, where have you locked Jesus out? You know what the New Testament says about sexual ethics. You know what the New Testament says, that it's only for marriage. You know that you're not supposed to live with someone you're not married to, and you don't care. But here's Jesus. All of your resources, you've locked Jesus out. No, absolutely. This is off limits, Jesus. You can have every other part of my life, but that one. Your friendships. Jesus, listen, I'm just trying to reach out to them. And I know that they're causing me to do some things that aren't healthy for my soul and push me away from you, but it's okay. I'm gonna. Yeah. Your time. Well, this is my time. Jesus, you get 1 hour a week. Be happy with that. Just be happy that I'm here today. And Jesus says, I want to have a relationship with you. I'm here because I love you. And you've kicked me out of your life. And Jesus said, I'm here. I want to be a part of your life. Can you imagine, maybe you got a friend that's just drowning. They're just drowning in life, just overwhelmed with everything that's happening. Their house is starting to just become disheveled, a mess. And just like, you know what? I'm going to pay for a cleaner to come to my friend's house to help them out. What an amazing thing to do. If you're looking for a friend to help that with, I'll put my name on that list, No. But can you imagine the person saying, they see a cleaner at their door knocking and they run. Like, I got to clean up my house really quick before I let them in. And you're kind of like, that's kind of the whole purpose, right? Like, what happens when you have someone come to your house unexpectedly? Like, I got to pick it up real quick. What we do in our house, we take all the dishes and you know what we do with them? We put them in the oven. That's a pro tip for you. If you need, you got some other people going, you just put them in the oven, no one sees it. But don't forget to take them out because then you're going to preheat your, that's happened before. We're like, you smell like plastic burning? We're like, oh, the oven. We put the dishes in there. Listen, some of us, we're thinking, before I open the door for Christ to come in, I got to clean up some stuff. I don't know how it happened, but I have drifted so far away, year after year after year, and I don't know how to get back over there. It feels like a long, long way, and I'm just really embarrassed. I'm doing things that I know are wrong. I'm doing things that I know clearly Scripture says is wrong. Yeah, I am living very selfishly. All of my prayers are about me, and I don't know. I don't know how to get back, and I'm just embarrassed by how far I've drifted. Jesus is saying, listen, that's what I'm here for. Jesus is saying, I'm here, and I'm going to help you clean it all up. You don't have to do it by yourself, and we can fix this, and we can get back on track again. But it starts with you opening your door. It starts by you saying, no, I don't want to drift anymore. Jesus, I need you to come in and fix it. Let's read it again. Revelation 3 and verse 20. Look, Jesus said, I stand at the door and I knock. And if you hear my voice and open the door, I'll come in and we'll share a meal together as friends. And we said familiarity with Jesus doesn't mean fellowship with Jesus. And I know most of you in this room are very familiar with Jesus. That's not the question. The question is there fellowship with Jesus? Is he truly the king of your life? Or have you locked him out of your life? Have you locked him out of his church? So as we wrap up, I want to ask you two questions. Number one, where have you kept Jesus out? Where are you keeping him out right now? That you've locked the door and said, no, you can't have this. You can have the other rooms, but not this one, not this one. And the second question I want to ask you, have you ever let Jesus in? Have you ever let him in? I'm not saying, do you know a lot of stuff about Jesus? I'm not saying, were you baptized when you were a baby? I'm not saying, like, did your grandma and your grandpa go to church? I'm saying, have you invited Jesus into your life? You open the door of your heart for him to come in. You're like, well, how do I do that? Man, I think one of the best ways to do that is through a prayer. And so I want to invite you to pray this prayer with me. Would you close your eyes? If you've never invited Jesus into your life, I'm not talking about your good outweighing your bad. That's not even possible. If it was, Jesus wouldn't have had to die on the cross. I'm talking about you saying, Jesus, I can never earn your love or make up for the sin that I've done. So if you're ready, here's the prayer that I want you to pray. Would you say this? Would you say, Jesus, I believe you are who you say that you are. The way, the truth, the life, the only way to the Father. I invite you in. I ask that you would forgive me of my sins and you make all things new. Others of you have invited Jesus into your life a long time ago, but slowly you've pushed him out. You've become wealthy. Your life has become easy. Sure, it's complicated, but a lot easier than it used to be. And slowly, life has just become about you. You haven't been fruitful for God's kingdom. And would you say, Jesus, I want to be fruitful for you? What if we just all say that out loud right now? Say, Jesus, I want to be fruitful for you. Let's say it again. Jesus, I want to be fruitful for you. Now, what if you say, Jesus, you are welcome in my life? Let's say that out loud. Jesus, you are welcome in my life. Let's say it again. Jesus, you are welcome in my life. Now, let's pray and say, Jesus, you are welcome in your church. You ready? Jesus, you are welcome in your church. Father, that is the desire of our heart, is that you would feel welcome here in your own house. That you're not a consultant, that you are King Jesus. You gave your blood, sweat, and tears, very literally, for us. And God, even though as we drift away, as we become useless for your kingdom, you're still there, knocking on the door of our hearts, calling us back to you, calling us back to fellowship and a relationship with you. And today, Jesus, we hear your voice, we hear your knock, and we open the door to you. Father, we pray that you would find us useful for your kingdom, that you would use us and all of our brothers and sisters at churches around the capital region to continue to move your kingdom forward right here. We ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.